The clinking of crystal glasses stopped. The heavily armed guards instinctively reached for their holsters. In a dining room suffocated by silence, a shy, overweight waitress had just spoken 12 words in a dead Sicilian dialect to the most ruthless mob boss in North America, and he was staring right at her. In the ultra-exclusive, notoriously cutthroat world of Manhattan's fine dining, being invisible was usually a curse. For Matilda Jenkins, known as Tilly to the few people who bothered to ask her name, it was a survival tactic. At Il Vento, an opulent restaurant draped in velvet gold leaf and secrets the waitstaff was curated as carefully as the wine list. The women were tall, impossibly slender, and glided between tables like runway models carrying silver trays. Tilly was none of those things. She was a size 20, soft-spoken and clumsy, only when people were staring directly at her. Her uniform standard-issue black and tailored for someone half her size had to be meticulously altered by her own hands just to let her breathe. The restaurant's general manager, a viciously critical man named Gregory, despised her. He kept her relegated to the back corners, serving the less important tables, openly mocking her weight in the kitchen, where the clatter of pots and pans drowned out his cruelty. "Keep the heavy girl out of the main dining room," Gregory would sneer to the maître d'. "Our clientele comes to look at beauty, not to be reminded of bakeries." But Tilly stayed. The pay was extraordinary, and she needed every dime to keep her grandmother in a respectable assisted living facility. Her grandmother Caterina was a fierce, sharp-tongued woman who had immigrated from a remote, treacherous mountain village in Sicily decades ago. Caterina had practically raised Tilly, feeding her pasta fierce love and a highly specific, nearly extinct dialect of Sicilian that sounded more like jagged rocks grinding together than the melodic Italian spoken on television. Tilly's invisibility worked perfectly right up until the night Matteo Vella claimed his territory. Matteo was the newly anointed head of the Vella crime syndicate. At 32, he was dangerously handsome, terrifyingly quiet, and possessed a reputation written entirely in blood. When he took over the corner booth at Il Vento for the first time, flanked by men whose tailored suits bulged with concealed weapons, the entire restaurant staff went into a quiet panic. Gregory, sweating profusely, had initially sent over Chloe, his favorite, thinnest waitress, to pour the wine. Chloe was so terrified of the men at the table that her hands shook violently, spilling a single drop of a $5,000 vintage onto Matteo's pristine cuffs. Matteo hadn't shouted. He hadn't even looked angry. He merely stared at the stain, then at Chloe, and quietly said, "Get out of my sight." The kitchen descended into chaos. No one wanted to approach the table. Gregory was on the verge of a panic attack when he spotted Tilly methodically polishing silverware in the back. Without a word, he grabbed her by the arm, shoved a fresh bottle of wine and a corkscrew into her hands, and pushed her through the swinging doors. "Serve them," Gregory hissed. "And if you mess up, you're not just fired. I'll make sure you never work in this city again." Tilly walked toward the corner booth. She could feel the heavy, predatory eyes of Matteo's men on her. She knew what they saw. A fat, nervous girl approaching a table of wolves. But as she reached the booth, a strange calm washed over her. These men were intimidating, yes, but they reminded her of the loud, overbearing men her grandmother used to chase out of her kitchen with a wooden spoon. She uncorked the bottle with smooth, practiced efficiency. Her hands didn't tremble. She poured the dark red liquid perfectly, the neck of the bottle hovering exactly an inch above the glass. Not a single drop wasted. Matteo Vella finally looked up from his conversation. His dark, calculating eyes locked onto her face, dropping briefly to take in her full, soft figure, before returning to her eyes. He didn't look at her with the disgust she expected, nor with the predatory leer his men occasionally wore. He looked at her with pure, unadulterated curiosity. You have steady hands. Matteo observed his voice, a low, gravelly baritone that sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. I try, sir, Tilly replied softly, keeping her gaze respectfully lowered. What's your name? Matilda, but most call me Tilly. Matteo took a slow sip of the wine, never breaking his gaze from her. Tilly, from now on, when I come here, only you serve my table. Understood. Tilly blinked, her heart hammering against her ribs. Yes, sir. Over the next 3 months, Matteo became a fixture at Il Vento, and true to his word, only Tilly was allowed to approach him. Gregory was furious but powerless. You didn't argue with a man who controlled the city's underbelly. Matteo was a puzzle. He was a violent man. Tilly had seen him take calls that resulted in people disappearing from the news the very next day, but to her he was surprisingly gentle. He would ask her about the food, listen intently when she described the specials, and on nights when the restaurant was quiet, he would sometimes just watch her move around the room. He seemed fascinated by her quiet grace, the way she didn't shrink away from his dark energy. He never commented on her weight, save for one night when Gregory tried to rudely push past her, calling her a clumsy cow. Matteo had calmly stood up, grabbed Gregory by the throat, and whispered something so terrifying into the manager's ear that Gregory had wept in his office for an hour afterward. After that, no one breathed a word about Tilly's size. But this strange, silent bubble of protection was about to violently shatter. The whispers started in the kitchen a week before the event. The Vella family patriarch was coming to America. Don Calogero Vella. Matteo's father was a legendary figure, a ghost from the old country, who still ran the global operations from a fortress in Sicily. He was known to be ruthless, entirely merciless, and deeply traditional. He was flying to New York to inspect his son's empire, and the tension radiating from Matteo was palpable. Il Vento was shut down to the public for the night of the Don's arrival. It was a private event for the highest-ranking members of the syndicate. The air in the restaurant was thick enough to choke on. Tilly had never seen Matteo look nervous, but as he stood by the entrance, adjusting his cuffs, he looked like a soldier preparing for a war he wasn't sure he could win. Tilly passa, Matteo said, stepping into the kitchen right before the cars arrived. He looked down at her, his eyes unreadable. My father is difficult. He is from a different time, a different world. Stay in the back tonight. Let Gregory handle the main floor. I don't want you in the crossfire. It was a protective gesture, and Tilly's heart swelled, but before she could nod, the heavy oak doors of the restaurant blasted open. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Don Calogero Vella had arrived. Calogero Vella was a man carved from ancient stone. He was in his late 70s, impeccably dressed, in a bespoke 3-piece suit, leaning on a polished walking cane, topped with a silver wolf's head. His face was a map of deep lines and scars, and his eyes, the same dark, calculating shade as Matteo's, were entirely devoid of warmth. He didn't walk into the restaurant, he invaded it. A dozen massive bodyguards filed in behind him, securing every exit. Lorenzo Matteo's underboss, and Enzo, his lethal shadow of a bodyguard, immediately flanked the patriarch. Matteo stepped forward to embrace his father, but Calogero only offered a stiff, formal kiss on both cheeks before his gaze swept the room with undisguised contempt. America! Calogero rasped in heavily accented English, his voice like sandpaper. It makes you soft, Matteo. It makes you care about the wrong things. Velvet curtains and gold paint. Bah! It smells like a tomb. Matteo's jaw tightened. Welcome to New York, Papa. The table is ready. Tilly watched from the safety of the kitchen doors, her stomach twisting into painful knots. The dinner was a disaster from the moment the first course was served. Calogero complained about everything. The pasta was too rich, the lighting was too dim. The men Matteo had hired were too undisciplined. He was systematically tearing down his son's pride in front of the entire syndicate. Gregory, desperate to impress the Don, was hovering nervously, directing the waitstaff like a manic conductor. But the tension was destroying them. A waiter named Thomas dropped a bread basket. A girl named Sarah started crying in the pantry. By the time the main course, a slow-roasted veal chop, was ready to be served, Gregory was violently pale. The Barolo. Gregory snapped, pulling a bottle of incredibly rare 100-year-old wine from the cellar. This needs to be served to the Don perfectly. Chloe, do it. Chloe backed away, her hands trembling so hard she looked like she was freezing. I can't. He terrified me. He looks like he wants to kill us all. I will literally end your career, Gregory hissed, raising his hand as if he might strike her. Tilly stepped between them, gently taking the dusty bottle from Gregory's shaking hands. I'll do it, she said quietly. Gregory looked at her, his disdain warring with his desperation. He looked at her soft waist, her round face, and sneered. If you embarrass us in front of that monster, I'll throw you out into the alley myself. Go. Tilly smoothed down her apron, picked up a fresh white cloth, and walked out into the dining room. The silence at the main table was oppressive. Calogero was lecturing Matteo, his voice low and dangerous, while the rest of the maid men stared at their plates, too afraid to interrupt. You let them forget who we are, Calogero was saying, tapping his heavy silver ring against the table. You treat this business like a corporation. It is not a corporation, Matteo. It is blood. And blood requires fear. Tilly approached the table silently. She moved to Calogero's right side, holding the bottle so the label faced him, presenting it flawlessly. Calogero stopped talking. He slowly turned his head to look at her. He didn't look at her with the subtle appreciation Matteo did. Calogero looked at her the way a butcher looks at meat. His eyes swept over her full hips, her thick thighs, the curve of her stomach beneath the apron. He scoffed a dry, ugly sound that echoed in the silent room. Then, assuming no one in this glamorous American restaurant could possibly understand him, Calogero leaned back and spoke to his men. But he didn't speak in English, and he didn't speak in standard Italian. He spoke in an archaic, highly localized dialect from the Madoni Mountains in Sicily, the exact dialect Tilly's nonna Caterina had spoken every day of her life. Talia accista. Calogero sneered to his underboss, his lip curling. In questa terra di rammolliti nutrono bene I loro maiali, ma una scrofa grassa non può servire il vino di un re. Si rovescerà il suo stesso grasso prima di versare il mio bicchiere. Look at this one. In this land of soft men, they feed their pigs well, but a fat sow cannot serve a king's wine. She will spill her own fat before she pours my glass. A few of the older imported Sicilian men at the table snickered darkly. Matteo, who understood the dialect, went rigid. His hands clenched into fists on the table, the knuckles turning bone white. He opened his mouth to intervene, the muscles in his jaw ticking with a sudden violent rage at his father's insult toward Tilly. But Tilly didn't give Matteo the chance to defend her. Something snapped inside her. It wasn't the insult to her weight she had heard worse from Gregory. It was the arrogance, the absolute certainty that she was beneath him, the disrespect to the very language her grandmother had taught her with love. Tilly didn't flinch. She didn't cry. Instead, she smoothly uncorked the bottle. With a steady, completely unshaking hand, She poured the dark, ruby-red Barolo into Calogero's crystal glass. She didn't spill a single drop. She gave the bottle a slight twist to catch the final drip, placed it gently on the table, and then, standing tall, she looked Don Calogero dead in the eyes. When she spoke, her voice wasn't the soft, submissive whisper of an invisible waitress. It was hard guttural, and rang out in the exact dead mountain dialect he had just used. "Upoku e pasciuto bonu, Don Vella," Tilly said, her pronunciation flawless, the harsh consonants snapping in the quiet room. "Ma ascrofa sapi canun savi a dare lacitu ai un lupo vecchio, o ci cascano l'ultimi denti. The pig is well fed, Don Vella. But the sow knows better than to serve vinegar to an old wolf, or his last teeth might fall out." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was an absolute vacuum. The clinking of crystal glasses stopped instantly. The heavy breathing of the men ceased. The heavily armed guards instinctively reached for their holsters, their eyes wide with shock. Matteo froze his dark eyes, snapping up to stare at Tilly in pure, unadulterated disbelief. No one spoke to Don Calogero Vella that way. No one. And certainly not a waitress in an American restaurant wielding a language that belonged only to the blood-soaked hills of Sicily. Calogero's face went entirely slack, his dark reptilian eyes locked onto Tilly's round, defiant face. The tension in the room pulled so tight it felt like the walls were going to crack. The bodyguards waited for the flick of the Don's wrist, the silent order to drag this woman into the alley and end her life for the disrespect. Tilly stood her ground, clutching the white cloth in her hands, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had just insulted the most dangerous man in the world. Calogero slowly leaned forward, his hands gripping the silver wolf's head of his cane. "Kusitu." "Who are you?" He whispered, the hostility in his voice suddenly replaced by something far more dangerous fascination. For 5 agonizing seconds, the dining room of Il Vento felt like the inside of a loaded gun. Tilly's breath was trapped in her throat. She gripped the white linen napkin so tightly her knuckles mirrored the pale cloth. At the table, Don Calogero Vella remained frozen, his ancient eyes boring into hers, dissecting her soul. And then the impossible happened. Don Calogero threw his head back, and a sound erupted from his chest, a rough, booming bark of laughter that rattled the crystal chandeliers. It wasn't a polite chuckle. It was a deep, joyous roar that echoed with genuine delight. The bodyguards visibly relaxed their hands, dropping from their holsters. The collective exhale in the room sounded like a gust of wind. "Incredible!" Calogero wheezed, wiping a single tear of mirth from his scarred cheek. He slammed his hand on the table, making the silverware jump. He looked at Matteo, pointing a trembling finger at Tilly. "A wolf? You hide a wolf in a waitress's uniform, my son. Who taught you to speak the tongue of the stones, girl?" Tilly swallowed hard, the adrenaline finally giving way to a trembling surge of relief. "My grandmother, sir. Caterina." Calogero's smile faded, slightly replaced by a razor-sharp curiosity. "Caterina, who there are many Caterinas in Sicily. Caterina Messina," Tilly said firmly, "from Petralia Soprana." The Don's heavy silver cane clattered to the floor. The sound was as shocking as a gunshot. Even Matteo looked startled as his father stood up slowly, bracing his hands on the table. The older man's face had drained of color. "Caterina Messina." Calogero whispered, the harshness completely gone from his voice. "The baker's daughter, the one who smuggled bread and ammunition to the partisans through the limestone caves in 1958. Tilly nodded slowly, stunned that this terrifying man knew her grandmother's teenage exploits. Stories Tilly had always assumed were exaggerated fairy tales meant to entertain a child. Yes. She married a mechanic named Jenkins when she came to New York. Calogero closed his eyes for a brief moment. When he opened them, the hostility that had tainted the entire evening was entirely vanquished. When I was 17, Calogero said softly, the Colombo faction pinned me down in an alley near Palermo. I was bleeding out. Your grandmother pulled me into a cellar, hid me under a pile of flour sacks, and lied to the men who would have put a bullet in my head. She is a woman of iron. He looked at Tilly, his gaze tracing her soft features, no longer seeing a fat sow, but the undeniable lineage of a legend. You have her fire, the body of a woman who knows how to eat, and the spine of a warrior. Sit down. Gregory, the restaurant manager, who had been watching this exchange from the shadows with a mixture of terror and utter confusion, suddenly rushed forward. He couldn't understand the dialect, but he saw Tilly standing over the Don and assumed she had ruined everything. I am so incredibly sorry, Don Vella, Gregory cried, grabbing Tilly roughly by the arm. She is clumsy, she is incompetent, and she is fired. I will have her removed immediately. Toglile le mani di dosso. The voice didn't belong to Calogero. It was Matteo. Matteo stood up his chair, scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He didn't raise his voice, but the murderous intent in his dark eyes made Gregory instantly release Tilly's arm, as if she had caught fire. Touch her again, Gregory. Matteo said, his voice a lethal vibrating hum. And I will have Enzo bury you under the foundation of this building. Gregory whimpered, backing away until he hit a pillar. Calogero watched his son's fierce protective display, then looked back at Tilly. A slow, knowing smirk spread across the old Don's face. I see, Calogero mused. You do not care about velvet curtains and gold paint after all, Matteo. You care about what is real. The Don gestured to the empty chair beside him. Sit, Matilda. Pour yourself a glass of my wine. We drink to Caterina. For the rest of the evening, the hierarchy of Il Vento was turned on its head. The invisible mocked overweight waitress sat at the right hand of the most feared mob boss in the world, conversing in a dead language while the terrified manager served them bread. Matteo watched her all night. He watched the way her eyes lit up when she spoke of her grandmother, the way her laugh, soft and musical, began to echo his father's booming chuckles. He had been captivated by her quiet grace for months, but seeing her courage, her absolute refusal to be minimized, ignited something deep and irrevocable inside him. The weeks following Don Calogero's visit changed everything. Tilly no longer worked the dark corners of the restaurant. In fact, she no longer worked at Il Vento at all. Matteo had walked in the next afternoon, thrown a thick envelope of cash at Gregory to cover Tilly's wages for the next 10 years, and gently escorted her out the front door. You are done serving men who don't appreciate your worth, he had told her, his hand resting warmly on the small of her back. He moved Caterina into a private, luxurious suite at an elite care facility in Manhattan, paying for round-the-clock specialists. When Tilly tried to refuse, Matteo had simply taken her hand, his thumb tracing her knuckles. Your family protected mine in the mountains, he said softly. Let me protect yours now. Their romance blossomed in the quiet, fortified walls of Matteo's penthouse overlooking Central Park. Free from the ill-fitting black uniform, Tilly wore flowing dresses in deep emeralds and rich burgundies that complemented her curves. Matteo worshipped her. He treated her body not as something to be ignored or tolerated, but as something divine. He would trace the soft swell of her stomach and the curve of her thighs with a reverence that healed years of Gregory's cruel whispers. But the Vela Syndicate was not a fairy tale. It was a business built on treachery. The twist came a month later, born from the very language that had saved Tilly. Lorenzo Matteo's underboss had grown greedy. Believing Matteo was distracted by his new unconventional lover Lorenzo, began plotting to align with a rival cartel from Chicago, intending to assassinate Matteo at a warehouse inspection. Lorenzo made his fatal mistake during a lavish syndicate gathering at Matteo's estate. Assuming Tilly was just a naive, soft-hearted woman who only understood English, Lorenzo stepped onto the terrace to take a secure phone call. He spoke in the rapid, coded mountain dialect of his ancestors, detailing the hit on Matteo for the following Tuesday. He didn't notice Tilly sitting quietly in the shadows of the garden, knitting a blanket for her grandmother. Tilly didn't panic. She didn't confront him. She waited until the party ended, walked into Matteo's study, and locked the heavy oak doors behind her. She poured him a glass of bourbon, sat in his lap, a weight he welcomed with a possessive groan, and repeated Lorenzo's conversation to him, word for word, translating the archaic slang with chilling accuracy. Matteo's expression darkened the ruthless mob boss, returning in a flash of cold fury. But when he looked at Tilly, his anger softened into profound awe. "You are my savior," Matteo whispered, pressing a kiss to her temple. "My beautiful, brilliant queen." When Tuesday arrived, Lorenzo and the Chicago hitmen walked into a bloodbath. Matteo, fully prepared, dismantled the betrayal with terrifying efficiency. Lorenzo was dealt with, and Matteo's grip on the East Coast underworld became absolute and unquestionable. To cement his victory, Matteo hosted a grand gala at Il Vento. The restaurant was unrecognizable, filled with the city's most dangerous and powerful figures. Gregory was still there, sweating and bowing, terrified of a misstep. When the heavy oak doors opened, the room fell dead silent, just as it had for Don Calogero. But this time, it was Matteo stepping through, and on his arm was Tilly. She was breathtaking. She wore a custom-tailored gown of midnight blue silk that hugged her generous curves, perfectly dripping in diamonds that Matteo had flown in from Antwerp. She walked with her head held high, radiating a quiet, dangerous power. She was no longer the invisible waitress. She was the reigning queen of the Vela Empire. As they passed the staff lineup, Gregory turned deathly pale. Tilly paused, locking eyes with the manager who had tormented her for years. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. She simply smiled, leaned in and whispered in perfect English, "You missed a spot on that wine glass, Gregory. Fix it before my husband decides to fire you." Gregory trembled, whispering a frantic apology as he scrambled away. Matteo chuckled, pulling Tilly flush against his side, his hand resting proudly on her hip. He kissed her deeply in front of every boss, politician, and soldier in the room, claiming her utterly. In a world obsessed with thinness, illusion, and shallow beauty, the most powerful man in the city had bowed to a woman with a soft body, an iron spine, and a heavy, beautiful soul. If Tilly's fearless confrontation with the Don and her unexpected romance with Matteo had you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Don't forget to share this incredible Mafia drama with your friends who love a fierce, underestimated heroine. Subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, real-life inspired stories, shocking twists and epic romances. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a chapter. Leave a comment below. Would you have dared to speak up?